Hi, it's Kiffin Lobates here, and today I want to talk about governance. And I realized that I haven't actually done that in a video, although there is a chapter on it in my book, Move Over Brokers, Here Comes the Blockchain. Now in the book, I present an analogy for how governance works in the blockchain world by looking at the checks and balances system of certain democracies. And you can look at the various groups that participate in keeping a blockchain running and ascribe certain roles to them. So, for example, the users of the blockchain system, the people who are transferring tokens around on it, correspond clearly to the electorate in a democracy. And the thing that users have is the kind of power that shareholders have in a company. Namely, they don't, generally speaking, have much influence on how the blockchain is implemented or how it evolves over time. But what they can do is they can vote with their feet. So if they don't like the system, they don't use it, and a blockchain system with no users has no function and no purpose and might as well not exist. Another example of a parallel is the developers of the blockchain system corresponding to the executive in government. The developers are the ones who actually implement policy. And then another area in governance is the group of people who decide what new features will be added to the blockchain or how the protocol will be changed. So that's a bit like Parliament, in that Parliament enacts laws and then the government is meant to ensure that they are brought into existence and enforced. And in the blockchain world, there's no clear group. It varies from blockchain to blockchain who has power over what the direction of the blockchain will actually be. Sometimes it's the blockchain developers who decide the direction of the project and then they go and implement it. And that is especially true early on in blockchain projects. Later, you may end up with a foundation or a committee or a group who discuss future protocol changes and stuff like that. Then you can have a separation between the developers and the group that actually decides the direction of the project. Anyway, there is a reason why I wanted to talk about all this stuff, and I've just set the background here. And the reason is that I found that there is another group that I don't discuss in my book. I talk about the executive, the judiciary, parliament, the role of oligarchs. Those correspond to whales in the cryptocurrency world, in that they are individuals who hold so many tokens that they can have a significant influence on the direction of the project. You don't, as a blockchain group, want to annoy the whales because they may just sell up and move out and crash the value of the token, or well, anyway, because of their wealth, they have the opportunity to exert far more pressure on the project than just your average user with a few tokens. Anyway, I got sidetracked from talking about this extra group, the group that I don't mention in my book, and they correspond to the press or the fourth estate or the media. And the discovery that I made came about due to a problem with the Ropsten Ethereum testnet. So there was a change in Ethereum recently. You may have read about it. It's called the London fork, and some changes were made, and those changes broke some of the clients that were running on the Ropsten testnet. It was the Geth client that had problems, and as a result, Ropsten ended up with a fork. And it didn't just end up with a fork, i.e. two different groups mining on different chains. The group that was mining on the wrong chain, the chain that didn't implement the policy change, actually managed to mine a longer chain. And according to blockchain law, it's the longest, most difficult chain that is the canonical one. So technically speaking, the London fork never really took off on Ropsten, except that it did. And the reason why it did is because the infrastructure support providers such as Etherscan, which is a blockchain explorer, and Infura, which is a blockchain API provider, decided to go with the London fork, and quite rightly so, because everybody had decided that this fork should come into existence, and it had been implemented, just not properly in the Geth client, as I said earlier. So if you compare the provider of these services, another one is MetaMask. MetaMask was keyed in to the London fork. If you look at MetaMask and Etherscan, and you look at Infura and the other service providers, the ones who actually sort of extract information from the blockchain and present it to the world, you'll find that they have an influence that I had overlooked before. And it's an influence very much like journalism in the political world. Namely, journalists are not politically appointed, they're not voted into a group by the electorate. They are, however, given power by the electorate because people read newspapers and that influences their worldview. And this is exactly the same thing that happened in the Ropsten blockchain, namely that although the chain that was smaller should have died off, what happened was, because the press, MetaMask, Etherscan and Infura, went with that chain, when you went to look up what your balance was, or when you went to look at what blocks had been mined and stuff like that, you found it was that chain that was being presented. And that's actually the thing that twigged me to the fact that my Ropsten node was on the wrong chain. Well, as I said, technically it was the right chain. It was the longer chain with a greater difficulty, but it was the wrong chain from my perspective, because by following that one, I was no longer getting access to all the services that I needed, my crypto wallet, the block explorer, so I could see what was going on, and so on. So I was actually pushed into moving onto the correct London fork. Now, I wouldn't have resisted anyway, because that's the fork I wanted to be on, but that's what alerted me to the fact that I was on the wrong one. And this is a specific incident, but it could happen in the real Ethereum chain. That if these groups, if MetaMask and Etherscan and Infura and other websites such as those all decided to collude and present information on an inferior chain, they could actually encourage a large group of the blockchain users to move onto that inferior chain, even though it would be shorter and would have less difficulty. And by encouraging people such as miners to move onto that chain, it would eventually overtake the other chain and take off. And I think this is quite a significant thing. I've not read anything about this before. The fact that we do have a fourth estate, we do have a press out there in the form of these services websites, and they do have a surprising amount of power, because if you have built dApps that rely on the services that they provide, actually I've thought of another one, GraphQL, which is a data aggregator from the blockchain. If you've built your website, your dApp, based on these services, you're going to want to be using the chain that they are presenting, and if they combine together, they actually have probably more power than possibly the miners or the blockchain developers, or even the, say in the case of Ethereum, the Ethereum Foundation. They really have a surprising amount of influence, just as the press does in society. So I thought that was very interesting. If you want to know a bit more about governance in blockchains, there is a whole chapter on it in my book, which I will just present again. You can find it on Amazon. I'll put a link to it in the comments below. And of course, there's a whole load of other stuff on blockchain in there too, using mainly analogies, because I love that as a method for explaining the concepts that are going on in an understandable way without actually losing any of the underlying meaning. So that's it for today, a bit longer than usual, but I think it was an interesting enough topic to make it worth a longer video. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and I'll see you all in the next video soon. Bye for now.